I'm going to be talking about great questions today, and I'll be pausing a couple of times and taking great questions from you. So that would be wonderful if you could be thinking about your great questions during this webinar. I'm also going to ask you at a point to help us. I'm going to tap into the collective wisdom and collective brains on the webinar, and we want to hear about some of the great questions that you ask, because at the end I'd like you to be able to add to your question bank of great questions. So Penny, are we ready to share the screen yet? Maybe not. So how about I just talk you through what we're going to be doing. So what we're going to cover is I'm going to look at what's going on in the brain when we're asked a question. So, you know, what happens from a brain perspective when someone asks us a question. And then I'm going to look at some of the language cautions, because I think that language is incredibly interesting and exciting, and I love the whole concept of language that we use. And there are some things that unintentionally in our languaging that we can generate a threat in people. So we'll talk a little bit about that. And then I want to look at some of the questions that we can pose when people have moved into that threat or protective state that might mitigate threat for those people. And finally, I'm going to ask, I'm going to look at some questions that you can add to your question bank, so you can take away some practical things. I think it's always really important from webinars like this that we take away something that's practical and useful to us. So I'm just wondering if Penny's got the slides up yet. If not, maybe is Dave on the webinar? Okay. All right, well, I'm just going to persevere without slides for a bit. How would a PowerPoint free for a moment slideshow sound? Is that okay with people? Okie dokie. So what I kind of want to talk about first is what goes on in your brain when you pose a question. And I'm going to ask you a question. So I'm going to ask you, what color is your house? Okay, so just think about that for a moment. After I asked this question, what did you think about? Well, you probably thought about the color of your house, didn't you? And we know that when we ask a question, it kind of hijacks your thought processes and you focus on it and you bring it to mind. So you brought to mind the color of your house or your apartment, or wherever you might be living right now. So that's really important to understand when we ask a question, that it does kind of take over your thoughts in your brain. And questions also trigger mental reflex, and this is known as instinctive elaboration. That's a pretty fancy term, isn't it? So when you ask someone a question, as I said, it takes over their brain's thought processes. And when your brain is thinking about an answer to a question, we can't contemplate anything else. Neuroscience research has shown that the human brain can only think about one thing at a time. So when you ask someone a question, you force their mind to consider only your question. In other words, people have your full attention. So asking great questions is a really powerful skill to add into your toolbox. And I'm sure you already have some great questions you ask, and I'm going to be inviting you to share some of those a little bit later. The next thing I want to talk about is a concept called mere measurement effect. And I'm just giving you a little bit of the broad science before I move into some of the practical applications. So behavioural neuroscientists have also found that asking people about their future decision, it really significantly influences those decisions. And that's a phenomenon that's known as this mere measurement effect. Social scientist Vicky Morwitz and her colleagues, they conducted a study with over 40,000 participants, and they showed that just asking someone if they were going to buy a new car within the next 6 months influenced their behaviour in terms of purchase rates by about 35%, which is quite extraordinary. And other studies have found really similar results, and it shows that behaviours can be increased by just asking about them. So it's clear that asking questions influences our decision making, and it prompts the brain to contemplate a behaviour which increases the probability it will be acted upon. So think about how you can use that in your own world. And Penny, I can see you're back on. Have you been able to share the slides?
Yes, which one are you up to?
I'm up to slide 5.
Oh, wonderful. Okay. Thank you. Just let me know when I get there, and I will share my screen with you right now. Apologies, everyone.
Thanks for your patience, everyone.
Are just wonderful, aren't they?
And if we can move to the next slide, please, which is this. I want to talk a little bit about the importance of asking other people for opinions. And we know that research by Tamer and Mitchell shows that humans devote about 30 to 40% of our speech output, so what we say, solely to informing other people about your own subjective experiences. And what the research shows is that we place really high subjective value on opportunities to communicate our thoughts and our feelings to other people. And doing this engages neural and cognitive mechanisms that are associated with reward. So in other words, it feels great to tell people about yourself and about how you're feeling. It kind of gives that burst of dopamine in that moment. And it's so rewarding that what the research has found. Okay, so I kind of lost my track of where I was. I was talking about asking for an opinion and this whole idea of getting a sense of reward when we talk about our feelings. And so I guess the takeaway from this is that there's real value in getting people to offer an opinion rather than just supplying information to people. And when we ask people to disclose their opinions, we see increased neural activity in the areas of the brain that are associated with reward and pleasure. So people like to be asked their opinions, and we know that when there are high levels of psychological safety, and you might have been on other webinars where I've talked about this concept, when we ask people for their opinion, it makes them feel valued, and it also supports that building of team psychological safety. Okay, so I'm just still admitting people into the webinar too, Penny. So I'm not sure if you want to keep an eye on that as well, whether that's going to be too tricky. Okay, so thank you for your patience. We're going to move on to the next slide. So Penny, if you can move to curiosity, that would be awesome. So curiosity, this is one of my favorite kind of topics, because I think one of the things that we need to really use as a lens in which to view the world is being genuinely curious. And we know that when we're genuinely curious and we're interested in other people, that comes across as an authentic kind of communication with another person. When we're not genuinely curious, the clever brains that are around actually pick that up, and we know that can cause lots of challenges as well. So remember to try and stay in that place of genuine curiosity. So be interested in what other people are saying, and think about questions that you can use that will show that you're genuinely curious. Can you move on to the next slide, please, Penny? Fantastic. So this is, it seems kind of obvious, this whole idea of listening deeply. But if you think about what I've just shared with you before, we love to talk about ourselves. We know that even when we give advice to other people, we see the reward centers of the brain light up. So it's very difficult from a biological perspective to kind of almost override that urge to be thinking about what you're going to say next, or thinking about the advice you're going to offer. It's really difficult then to listen deeply. And one of the things that I think is really important if we're going to be asking good questions is we have to be able to pay real attention to the content of the conversation that is going on, and to try and hold yourself back, I guess, from formulating your response in the moment. It's important to listen deeply, share what you think you have understood that the other person has said. And this is pretty basic communication skills, but I think it's good to be reminded of this. Share back what you've heard, and that way the person feels heard before you offer your thoughts or suggestions. I'm just going to pause for a quick moment here. Are there any questions or comments that people want to share at this point? I know you've all been very patient with the technical difficulties. Are there any questions or comments?
All good this
All
end.
good. Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Sorry, I do have one from Nancy. We would love to know more about the research of 30-40%.
We'll send the link to that paper so you can have a look at that paper yourself. And yeah, we'll send that in the follow-up email that does the replay of this technically challenged webinar. So thanks for that. All right, I'm going to keep pressing on because we have lost a bit of time with some of the technical difficulties. So next slide, please, Penny. One of the things I think I said at the beginning of the webinar is I'm really fascinated by this whole idea of language and how we use language. And one of the things that really struck me when I first started looking at this material was some research that was shared with me in my postgraduate studies around that they were monitoring what happens from a brain activity perspective in children when they're sitting in front of a computer and the computer is just saying in a very monotone kind of tone, well done, well done, well done. And when they looked at activity, they saw the reward centers lighting up in these children just from that, well done. So I think language is really interesting. One of the things that we share with our students that is probably one of the most challenging concepts is this idea of avoiding why-based questions. So why should we avoid why? And the answer to that is quite simple. We know that the brain craves autonomy, so we want to be masters of our own destiny and feel like we have choice and influence. And we also want to feel like we're important, that we have some sense of significance or status or a sense of positive self-image. When we ask people, why do you think that? It actually generates a threat. You might be, genuinely curious, but think about how you can replace why with some different phrases. And I'll give you some examples a little bit later on in the webinar. So that would be my first big tip, is try and avoid why-based questions, because they do unintentionally generate a threat which shuts down and means that people can't think as clearly, and maybe you don't get the most innovative solutions if you're kind of working on a problem together. As I said earlier in the webinar, we love giving advice. It's inherently rewarding. But when we start saying things like, you should consider, or you should do this, it again generates a threat and it doesn't work well for the brain. Other things like, that's not how I would do it. This is how I would do it. Again, these are kind of things, these are statements. And remember what that I said earlier in the webinar, that people love for their opinions to be asked. So there's quite a bit significant difference between this sort of style of conversation with another person as opposed to being genuinely curious and asking for opinions. Yes, but using the word it's always quite a dismissive word. So yes, you're saying you agree with that person, but I don't think, or I think we should do X, Y, and Z, actually dismisses and negates what that person has just said to you. Everyone else gets it. I don't know if you've ever been on the receiving end of that statement. That can be pretty disheartening as well. And again, things like, if I were you, so that's that tendency that we have to give advice, and really I would kind of caution against using that sort of language. Next slide, please, Penny. For the frequent flyers on our webinars, and I know, welcome back to all those people that come to our webinars. We love your support. We love you joining us. You would have heard me talking about the 5 key drivers that influence behaviour. So I'm not going to go in depth on this. If you want to go and see some more material on this, have a look at our past webinars, and it has more detail. So really there are 5 key things that we're looking at. We want to maintain, there's a drive to maintain a positive self-image. So that question of, do I matter in the eyes of others? We're constantly trying to predict what's going to happen next. So we're looking at, certainty, and the brain, and we know, is a prediction organ. Autonomy, I just spoke about that before. We want to feel like we have, we're masters of our own destiny, and we have choice and influence over what is happening to us. Again, that's really difficult in the context of lockdowns and all that sort of thing. Our drive to bond with other people is this relatedness and feeling like we belong, we're part of a tribe or part of a group. And finally, the drive to feel like we're being treated fairly and equitably, which is also a really strong driver. So when you think about these things, if we're working with another person and there's a challenge or an issue, it's really important to try and get to the heart of the issue. So if you could go to the next slide, please, Penny. And one of our wonderful students, he shared how he was using this in a coaching session, and I thought it was really brilliant. So what he did with the person that he was working with is he had shared that care or scare framework with them, and then when they were talking through the challenge that person was facing, he was able to ask some really good questions that helped him to find out where was the threat coming from, what was the challenge for that person. And this person was able to say, look, it's not about significance. For me, it's really about certainty. So they had a really big challenge around the certainty. They didn't understand what was happening and they didn't have some clarity. So that gave him some guidance then about how he could ask further questions to support them to kind of gain that certainty. They also had a really a bit of a challenge in the equity domain. So they felt like things that were happening were not fair. So it's a really nice way to be able to focus your questions so it becomes kind of laser sharp in being able to have a useful conversation with another person. So that's another little kind of one that you can take away and give a go, and I'd love to hear how that works for you. Next slide, please, Penny. I thought it might be useful just to give a quick sample of some of the questions that you can use to address threat or mitigate threat in those different domains. And, you know, if you're looking at significance, it's really these people are wanting, if there's a threat in that domain, it's about, well, I want to be appreciated. I want to feel like I matter and that you regard me positively. So it could be a question as simple as, how can I tap into your expertise better? How can I make sure that we are able to leverage off your wisdom and your skills and your experience? So when we do that, that supports people to feel pretty good about themselves, and it also invites them to share their opinion. The second one, if people are saying they don't feel there's any certainty, and obviously that's a massive issue right now, saying to people, what can I do to give you some more certainty? What do you need from me? What would support you to have some further clarity around this challenge, issue, problem, whatever it is that you're discussing? The next one's around autonomy. And so it's kind of like, if a person's feeling like they're not having autonomy, then they're feeling like they don't have choice, it's actually asking them, what could I do that might support you to have more choice or more influence around this situation, issue, problem, whatever it is. And, you know, sometimes it might be something really small, but it's these little things that can actually support you to mitigate threat and actually change what's happening for a person and help them to feel less hunkered down in kind of protective mode and more in that productive mode. You know, relatedness, what can I do to demonstrate that I care about you, or what do you need from us to feel like you are part of this group and that you're connected with us? I think this is really important when we're all trying to, you know, many of us are still working from home. How do we make sure we've got a kind of a connection plan so we don't lose sight of feeling like we're part of a team or a group? And the next one, I think a really great question when someone says this just doesn't feel fair, is to actually ask them, what would fair look like here from your perspective? And I think that's really important. And one of the things I always say is when you ask questions like this, particularly if a person is feeling in that little bit of threat, make sure that you pause and give time for them to respond. You know, that we naturally don't feel comfortable with silence. So it's really important to actually stop and let that person make the connections themselves and have their own insights. Okay, next slide, Penny. I was trying to think about some of the things that are really useful that I've shared over the time that I've been working with many people. And one of the things I think that's really key is people talking about, you know, how do I manage performance? How do I keep people accountable? And so I just wanted to give you some examples of some things that you can do that are kind of brain friendly in terms of trying to hold people and ourselves to account, because it's really important that we perform well, you know, that we have high levels of psychological safety, but we're also, you know, being productive and performing well. And so really, this is about trying to give a person a sense of control. So it's actually about giving people around autonomy around how they are held to account. So, I've got some sample questions there. I hear your intentions around X, whatever the issue is. Can you share some evidence or activity that demonstrates your commitment to it? So, again, you're asking that person for their opinion, what they would suggest that might happen in that circumstance. What do you feel you're responsible for? It's a really good question. Find out what people do feel like they're responsible for, and what do you feel is outside of your control. And that's really important, particularly in uncertain times like now. How do you want me to hold you accountable for X, whatever it is, in a way that will sound supportive rather than negative? So again, you're inviting that person to decide how you're going to hold them to account. Next slide, please, Penny. Just a few more to add into your accountability question bank. And it's something similar like, how would you like me to approach you if you don't follow through with the commitments you make? And how would you like me to bring this up? So it's almost like you develop a social contract around holding each other to account. And I think that's where we start to see teams really lift and perform well, and it mitigates that threat. How long do you think it's going to realistically take you to complete the task, considering the worst case scenario? So again, this really helps put some boundaries around timing around things. And looking at your current commitments, when can you realistically devote the time you need to complete this? And this is really important, because one of the things that we share in the work that we do is this idea of how we commit greater resources to our future self. So we think we can do something and we'll agree to do something because we always think our future self will have more resources available to it than we do right now. So it's really important to kind of help people to guard against overcommitting their future self to stuff they can't possibly achieve. So those are some kind of ideas for that kind of accountability piece. Now, one of the things I always recommend to people is start to develop your own great question bank. What is it that you can add in that would be useful and kind of takes into account some of those things I spoke about before, about genuinely curious questions. What are your questions around asking people for their opinion? What are your questions around exploring an issue or about supporting innovation? And what I'd love to do right now is just to invite you for a moment to, in the chat pane, type in some of the favourite questions that you ask, because you already have questions in your question bank. And I love tapping into the collective wisdom of a group of amazing individuals like all of you on the call. And I'm curious if we could just type some of those into the chat pane, that would be fantastic. And I'm just going to, because I know Penny's been driving the slides. Penny, do you want me to look at the chat pane? Or are you okay?
No, that's fine. We do have a couple of statements and questions while people are doing that. Would you like me to?
That would be great.
Okay. So Anna mentioned earlier that she struggles sitting with silence when someone doesn't respond to a question.
And can I just respond to that? I think that is really challenging, and because we feel uncomfortable with silence, so we tend to fill up the space by talking. One of the things that I've worked with people over the years is actually just do some counting in your head. If you're finding it really hard to stay silent, just count to 10. And just by doing that, you actually are, giving people that time to respond. And look, silence is an incredibly powerful tool, and I don't think we use it often enough. And I think it's also really challenging in a Zoom environment. You can see everyone, in these little tiles, a bit like the Brady Bunch. And so we've got to be able to also have silence in that context as well. Other comments, Penny?
Yeah, so Kathy has said that at her old work, we had a yes and. We used it in training sessions like team sport, and we had to take it in turns to say yes and build on a point instead of yes but, which detracted, and it's harder than we think, she comments.
I'm sure it is, because we're always formulating our response in our head. We're sort of saying, well, I agree with that component, but I don't agree with that point. So you'll say, yes, blah, 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 but. So I love that yes and then and doesn't elicit the thread in the brain. So it's a really great strategy. Thank you for sharing that, Kathy.
So yeah, Kathy, it's great. Kathy said in answer now to the questions, what would happen if?
Yep.
Yvette has gone, knowing yourself, what do you think will get in the way of you achieving this goal?
These are great questions, really supporting people to have their own insight and think and offer their opinion. Great questions.
Lainey is suggested what's holding you back right now.
Yeah, lovely question. Really kind of strength-based question. I love that.
Nancy has suggested what would success look like to focus, in brackets, to focus on a future state.
Great question, and I love getting people to think about success. I think one of the things that's really key and important, and we don't have time to go into it in any detail, but generally we see a continuum of prevention to promotion mindset. So people naturally kind of sit somewhere along that continuum. And one of the things, I did a lot of solution-focused and strength-based training all around Australia, and the what would success look like is great for promotion mindset. People like me, I can get straight into that. For prevention mindset, I think we need to be very mindful that sometimes they're more motivated by a question like, what would happen if you don't get to where you want to get to, or if it remains the same right now? That helps them to think about, because they're people that are more prevention mindset aren't as they don't have as great an appetite for change, and thinking about best case scenario isn't always going to be the most motivating for them. So try and think about how you can, if that question, the success one, doesn't work, try flipping it on its head and asking what would happen if you don't achieve what you're or it stays the same. What else have we got there, Penny?
From Kathy again, how can I support you in that? What do you need from me?
That's lovely, because that actually gives that person that choice and some autonomy to say what help they need from you. And I think that can be a really powerful, wonderful question.
From Yvette, what's the worst that will happen if you achieve this goal? In brackets, hunt out the payoff for them having done that already. It's an ecology check to make sure they aren't going to create other problems by adopting a new behaviour.
Nice. That's a really sophisticated question, I bet. I like that, because it does help people to think about, if you adopt this new behaviour, what might be some of the repercussions around that, and helps you guard against some of those repercussions. Great question.
From Debbie, what would be helpful now for you?
Nice question. Beautiful.
Lainey, what's one thing you could do to propel you forward?
Yeah, that lovely question around how do you maintain momentum, and I think that's lovely.
Meg, once I heard on a TED Talk, what would happen if you looked at your story and wrote it from another person's point of view? What would you see from this wider view? This
is a great question, and I love that idea of inviting people to be a kind of a spectator, an impartial spectator of their own story, because it does mean that you actually view things in a completely different way. So we know from a biological perspective, it actually changes kind of what's happening in your brain from thinking of self to actually noticing what might be an impartial spectator might view. And I know that this is a very useful in terms of post-traumatic stress, where we invite people to actually look at a different way of viewing something, because every time that we have a story and we retell that story, we then put the story away in a different way. So there's beautiful opportunities to invite people to reframe or reappraise a situation and put some more positive emotions attached to that story. So thank you for that, Meg. Oh,
I love this one. What question you don't want me to ask?
great question. I love that. Yeah, that's a really good question. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
From Karen, imagine this as a ladder. What is the first step you need to
Yeah,
take?
yeah, that's really nice. And that's really takes people into that action phase when you've explored an issue and you want to be able to get them to think about what's the first thing that they might do. And I think that's really important because if we then write a list of 10 things we should do, that's overwhelming for the brain. So I love that. Just let's think about what you first need to do. Beautiful question.
And three more. What's going to happen if we don't do anything from a vet?
Nice.
Tasneem, let me know your thoughts.
Yeah, that's nice because we want to be able to think about, we want to know what's in that metacognition for someone, what is in their thoughts, how they've got to a particular opinion or position about something.
And the last one, there's a question and a comment from Anna. What's the question here that we are not asking?
Yeah, that's one of my favourites. And I've actually got it in a list I'm just about to share with you. So it's a really good question to ask. Thank you, everyone. Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, Anna also said counting to 10. It's so simple. She is going to try it in relation to the silence. So that's it. Well done, everyone.
Thank you. They're brilliant questions. I really appreciate you sharing those with us, and I hope that you've all, grabbed a few of those and quickly jotted them down. Next slide, please, Penny. And I think this should have transitions in it, Penny. So you might have to click one at a time. So let's start with the first one. So these are just some curious questions. These are questions that I love to ask people. And for people that have been on my study calls, you'll notice when someone says to me, Linda, I want to ask you a question, and I'll say, yeah, and they'll say, what do you think about X, Y, and Z? You'll notice that I always turn to the group and say, what do other people think? But generally, I would start with a question around, do you already have a hunch about this? Because often people will pose a question, but they've done some thinking about it. And so I ask, do you have a hunch about this already? Sometimes they'll say no, but in most cases, people will share something about that helps you also to understand more about what they're actually asking from you. So that's my first one. Click on to the next one, Penny. I think actually one of the things we know is that when people come up with an opinion or a position about something, there's a history to that. We often have been thinking about something for a period of time. So I think it's really good to actually ask people, can you talk me through how you came up with this idea or how you came to this position? Particularly if someone has a very firm viewpoint. You say, hey, I can appreciate you've got a really strong view around this. Can you help me understand how you came to this view? I'm really curious to understand the thinking that led to that. And I think one of the questions already kind of alluded to that. So that's, click on the next one. So, again, it seems you have a firm opinion about this. Can you share with me what led to this? So kind of links with that other question. This is the next one, Penny. This is another question, and it was shared to me by a colleague, and I loved it. And so it's this question that she asks people when people are a little bit stuck, and she'll say to them, "What is the most outrageous thing we could or you could do here?" And again, you need to stop and give some silence because that actually takes a little bit of thinking for people. And it's really interesting when you ask that question. Often they'll say something that they think is outrageous, and then they'll actually go, that's not so outrageous, is it? And the example she gave me when she shared this question with me, she was doing some coaching with a person who was a workaholic. They were working incredibly long periods. They weren't seeing their family, and they really wanted to change that. And so she asked this question of this person, what is the most outrageous thing you could do here? And he said to her, well, I could go home early one day. And he laughed, and then he sat back and he went, well, I could, couldn't I? So it was really interesting that he thought that was outrageous, but then it became something that he could possibly do. Next one, Penny, I think this has already been shared. Is there a question we haven't asked about this? I think it's a really powerful one. And again, when you're stuck, this can be a really good question to ask when you're in that period of feeling stuck, or when you think you've got to the end of something, but you think, let's just have one more kind of look at it. And the last one, what would others say about this? Which is kind of that perspective taking, or that outside perspective. So, you know, if you're as a team coming up with something, what would other people in the organisation say about this? Or what would they have the same view, or would they have a different view? What do we predict might be the views that we haven't considered or thought about? So they're just some of my favourite questions. I have a bunch of them, but I just thought I'd give you some example. And you'll see that there's no why-based questions there. And I really loved in the chat pane, there was no why-based questions there. So it's really about being genuinely curious and all those sort of things. So I guess asking great questions, really for me, it comes down to a few things that I've shared with you in this webinar. The first is ask for people's opinion. Find out what they're thinking. Don't just ask for information, but genuinely find out what people, you know, what their opinion is and what they think about things. Stay genuinely and authentically curious. Pretending to be curious doesn't work. Listen deeply. So make sure you listen and reflect back the content of what the other person has said, so that they feel understood and heard. Mind you, can I just make sure everyone's on mute? I can just hear some typing in the background. Maybe someone's taking some notes, but that's awesome. Mind your language. So be really careful in trying, and if it's a habit, it's going to take a while to break. If you can eliminate why-based questions and the but word, that would be, you'll notice a big difference. And it does take perseverance and focus and attention. Being grateful. Again, I don't think that was so. The next webinar, we are delighted. We have a guest, Bronnie Humes. She's one of our alumni, and she works in the change space, and she does some awesome work. And I've had the privilege of collaborating with her around development of models and some stuff. So she's going to be talking about the brain, so what? Conversations about change. So she's going to be she kind of has put a neuroscience lens over the whole change process, and she's going to be sharing that. So it's a really exciting webinar that if you haven't signed up for, make sure you do. Last slide, that has our resources and contacts. If you're new to our webinars, we have a ton of free webinars that you can have a look at. Check out our blog, and remember that we have some awesome courses that if you're wanting to dive deeper into this area, that you can get more information about those as well. Thank you for your patience with the technical difficulties. I'm going to pause now, and I normally finish at 12:45, so I think I've done pretty well to finish at 12:49. And if you wish to remain on the call, that would be fantastic. We'll be taking questions. I'll stay here till 1 o'clock. If not, thank you very much for your participation, and I wish you well in asking great questions. So thank you. So I'm curious, any questions, comments for those that are still on the call? Penny, are you still with me?
Yes, fantastic. I am.
Okay.
Mark has asked, is it possible to share the questions that everyone submitted?
I believe when you watch the replay, you can actually see that the chat pane and be able to see the questions that are posed in there. Is that correct, Dave? Dave, you're on mute.
Sorry, I was just typing a question actually.
Oh,
what was that?
So the question was, if people see the replay, they can see the chat pane, can't they? And they can see the questions that were posed.
We will try and arrange that. There are different versions, so
yep, great.
We'll get that somehow.
Okay, fantastic. Any other comments or questions?
Anna has got her hand up. So Anna, if you'd love to come off mute, we'd love to hear your question.
You still with us, Anna?
She's written, thanks again, Penny and Linda. Even with the glitches, you're both awesome. That's so nice. Thank you. That's really lovely.
Dave, you have asked a question, why do we hate silence so much? I almost feel like saying, do you have a hunch around that, Dave?
No, I don't, but I'm just wondering exactly what the driver is, how it fits in with threat or whatever.
Because we're kind of born to connect with other people. We want to feel connected to people. And when there's silence, it starts to generate a little bit of discomfort for us. So it's not a comfortable space for many people, that silence. And I think just culturally, you know, we don't value silence. We don't value that in our society. So we generally, there's two things. I guess it feels uncomfortable, but also when there's a moment of silence, because we love talking about our subjective experience and feelings, it's very easy to fill up that silence with then speaking about those things because it feels rewarding. So I think silence can make people feel uncomfortable because it doesn't feel like we're connecting with people and relating well with people. But it's very important, and it's very important because the brain actually needs to turn inwards and have less information coming to us in order to have insights and be able to think clearly. Any other questions or comments?
Nothing in the chat, but I'm sure that people are pondering.
Well, I'm really pleased that you were able to join us, and thank you for your patience around the technical difficulties. We will send out the replay. We might have some cutting to do to bring them both together. I'm not quite sure how that happens. Thank you to Penny, my co-host, who seamlessly went in and took over when I had technical difficulties. I really appreciate that. So thank you. Have a wonderful brain-friendly day, everyone, and I look forward to seeing you on the next webinar. Thank you.